the grim darkness of the far future, there are few sounds more terrifying than the mechanical thunder of a dreadnought awakening from centuries of slumber. The grinding of ancient gears, the hiss of hydraulics pressurizing, the whir of targeting systems coming online after millennia of silence. But imagine, if you will, that this awakening happens not in the sacred halls of a Space Marine fortress monastery, not surrounded by reverent tech priests and chapter chaplains performing the proper rituals, but rather in the presence of the galaxy's most enthusiastic and destructive scavengers. Imagine what happens when an Ork war boss and his mob of boys stumble upon a dreadnought that has been sleeping for 4,500 years. This is not a hypothetical scenario born purely from imagination. Throughout the vast expanse of the galaxy, countless Space Marine war machines lie dormant in forgotten battlefields, abandoned fortress monasteries, and the twisted corridors of space hulks that phase in and out of the warp. These ancient warriors, entombed in walking sarcophagi of adamantium and ceramite, wait in stasis for the day they might be recovered by their brothers. But the Imperium is vast, resources are stretched thin, and the galaxy is a chaotic place where not everything that should be found is found by those who should find it. Sometimes, the greenskins get there first. What follows when Orks discover one of these ancient warriors is a collision between two of the Imperium's greatest nightmares. On one side, you have a superhuman veteran of wars fought millennia ago, a hero who has seen the glory days of the Imperium and refuses to accept death, preserved through technology that borders on the miraculous. On the other, you have the unstoppable green tide, creatures whose very existence seems to mock the laws of physics, whose technology works through sheer belief, and whose appetite for violence is matched only by their love of looting anything they can get their massive green hands on. This is a meeting that will shake the very foundations of both war machines involved. And the story of what happens when these two forces collide tells us something profound about the nature of both. But before we can truly understand the magnitude of this encounter, before we can appreciate the chaos and violence and strange respect that might emerge from such a meeting, we need to understand what exactly a dreadnought is, what it means to be entombed within one for thousands of years, and why the Orks, of all the galaxy's myriad threats, present such a unique and terrifying challenge to even these walking fortresses. The living tomb. Understanding the dreadnought. A dreadnought is not simply a machine. It is not merely a weapons platform or a suit of particularly heavy armor. A dreadnought is a prison, a life support system, and a holy relic all wrapped into one towering construct of ceramite and adamantium. Standing anywhere from 12 to 15 feet tall, these mechanical giants stride across battlefields with the weight of centuries behind every step, their massive frames bristling with weapons that can level buildings and punch through the heaviest armor. But beneath all that metal and firepower, suspended in amniotic fluids within an armored sarcophagus, lies what remains of a space marine who should have died but was deemed too valuable to lose. The process of becoming a dreadnought pilot is not an honor that any space marine seeks, despite what Imperial propaganda might claim. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced physiology cannot save them, when limbs are torn away and organs destroyed beyond the skills of even the chapter's apothecaries to repair, a terrible choice must be made. The warrior could be allowed to die with dignity, their gene seed harvested for the next generation of warriors, their name added to the rolls of honored dead. Or, if they are deemed exceptional enough, if their tactical acumen and combat experience are too precious to lose, they can be interred within a dreadnought. What this means in practice is horrifying. The Space Marine's ruined body is reduced to its most essential components. The brain, the vital organs that can be preserved, perhaps fragments of the torso and spine. These remnants are then hardwired directly into the dreadnought systems through a process that combines the most advanced bionics with arcane technologies dating back to the dark age of technology. The pilot's consciousness becomes one with the machine. They no longer see through eyes, but through optical sensors and targeting arrays. They no longer hear with ears, but through acoustic sensors that pick up everything from whispered conversations to the roar of artillery. Touch becomes pressure readings on armor plating. Taste and smell are replaced by chemical analyzers and atmospheric sensors. Every sense that once made the marine human is stripped away and replaced with cold, mechanical efficiency. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Imagine waking up one day to find that you can no longer feel your hands because your hands no longer exist. You cannot turn your head because you have no neck. You cannot breathe because your lungs have been replaced by a life support system that forces oxygenated fluid through what remains of your respiratory system. You are a brain floating in a jar, hardwired into a walking tank, and this is your existence for as long as your chapter needs you to fight. And fight you will, because there is no retirement from service as a dreadnought. The only escape is destruction in battle, and even then, your chapter will fight to recover your sarcophagus so that it might be repaired and reused with another fallen hero. Between deployments, dreadnoughts are kept in stasis sleep, their consciousness effectively turned off to preserve what remains of their sanity. For some, this sleep lasts decades. For others, centuries. The most ancient, like Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves, have been awakened and put back to sleep hundreds of times over 10,000 years, experiencing only brief windows of consciousness, separated by vast oceans of dark nothingness. This cycle of awakening and sleep takes its toll. Each time a dreadnought is roused from stasis, they find that more time has passed than they expected. Brothers they knew are dead. The chapter has changed. Tactics have evolved. Technology has degraded or been replaced. The galaxy itself has moved on while they slept, and they must adapt quickly because they are only awakened when the need is dire. Some dreadnoughts, like the Blood Angels' Death Company dreadnoughts, have succumbed entirely to madness, their consciousness fractured by the combination of the black rage and the psychological trauma of their existence. Others become increasingly detached from humanity, their personalities eroding over centuries until they are more weapon than warrior, responding to commands with mechanical efficiency, but displaying little of the brotherhood and courage that once defined them. But not all dreadnoughts lose themselves to time. The most exceptional maintain their identity through sheer force of will, holding on to memories of who they were and what they fought for, with a desperation born of knowing that these memories are all that separate them from becoming mere killing machines. These are the venerable dreadnoughts, the ancients, whose wisdom is sought by chapter masters, and whose tactical acumen has been honed over millennia of warfare. They serve not just as weapons, but as living repositories of their chapter's history, able to speak of battles fought when the Imperium was young and the Emperor still walked among men. To be entombed in a dreadnought is to exist in a state between life and death, duty and damnation. It is to serve your Emperor and your chapter long past the point where any reasonable being would beg for the peace of death. And it is into this strange half-existence that our ancient warrior has been locked for 4,500 years, longer than some chapters have existed, longer than some civilizations have risen and fallen. This dreadnought went to sleep in an age when the Imperium was different, when the threats it faced were not yet what they would become. And now, after all these centuries, it is about to wake up, not to the reverent chants of tech priests and the litanies of chaplains, but to the raucous laughter and brutal enthusiasm of the Orks. The ancient warrior's last memory. To understand what our dreadnought will experience upon awakening, we must first understand what it experienced before it slept. 4,500 years ago, in the 37th millennium, the Imperium was already ancient by human standards, but still maintaining some semblance of the glory it had known during the Great Crusade. Our warrior, let us call him Brother Captain Meridius of the Crimson Castellans chapter, was a veteran of 3 centuries of warfare before he fell. He had led his company through campaigns against Xenos empires that no longer exist, had defended worlds whose names had been struck from imperial records, had stood shoulder to shoulder with warriors who are now little more than faded entries in dusty tomes. His last battle was against a chaos incursion on the world of Talasar Prime, a prosperous agri-world that fed 3 nearby systems. The heretics had emerged from a warp rift with promises of dark gods and impossible power, corrupting the planetary governor and his inner circle before the Crimson Castellans could respond. By the time Meridius and his company made planetfall, 1/3 of the population had already fallen to chaos, and demonic entities walked openly in the streets of the capital Hive. The battle was brutal, even by the standards of space marine warfare. Meridius led the assault on the corrupted planetary palace, his company fighting through wave after wave of cultists and traitor guard, while demonic entities manifested in the very air around them. He remembered the weight of his power sword in his hand, the way it hummed as it cleaved through corrupted flesh. He remembered the faces of his battle brothers, warriors he had fought beside for decades, falling one by one to the heretics' dark weapons. He remembered the voice of Brother Titus on the Vox, calm and professional, even as he reported critical damage to his power armor. He remembered Brother Sergeant Castor standing back to back with him as they held a breach against a tide of screaming cultists. And he remembered the moment everything went wrong. The Chaos Sorcerer, leading the cultists, had summoned something from the warp, a creature of living shadow and screaming metal that tore through the Crimson Castellans' ranks with terrifying efficiency. Meridius had charged it, knowing that, if he did not stop it, his entire company would be annihilated. The thing had met his charge with malevolent glee, and for a moment they were locked in single combat while the battle raged around them. He remembered landing a solid blow, his power sword carving through whatever passed for the demon's torso. He remembered its shriek of pain and rage, and then he remembered nothing but fire and agony as the creature's retaliation tore through his armor and his body alike. His spine was shattered, his legs were gone, his left arm was burned to the bone, internal organs were ruptured beyond count. By all rights, Brother Captain Meridius should have died on that battlefield, his gene seed harvested and his name added to the chapter's roll of honored dead. But the Crimson Castellan's Master of the Forge had other plans. The chapter was still young, only 800 years old at the time, and it could not afford to lose officers of Meridius's caliber. More importantly, they had recently recovered an ancient Dreadnought, chassis from a space hulk, a Contemptor-pattern war machine dating back to the Horus heresy itself. It had been waiting for a pilot worthy of its honor, and Brother Captain Meridius, hero of Talasar Prime and savior of 3 systems, was deemed that pilot. He remembered fragments of the surgery. The cold embrace of the sarcophagus, as what remained of his body, was lowered into the amniotic fluids. The burning sensation as neural interfaces were plugged directly into his brainstem. The sudden, overwhelming rush of sensations as his consciousness was hardwired into the Dreadnought's systems. Everything was too loud, too bright, too much. He tried to scream but had no lungs to scream with. He tried to move his hands but had no hands to move. Panic overtook him, and he thrashed against his new prison, the Dreadnought's massive arms smashing through medical equipment before the tech priests could sedate his systems. When he finally awoke, properly awoke with his consciousness integrated into his new body, he found himself in the chapter's Hall of Ancients, surrounded by chaplains and tech priests who explained his new existence. He would serve the Emperor and the Crimson Castellans until either he was destroyed in battle or the chapter no longer had need of him. Between deployments, he would sleep in stasis, preserved against the ravages of time. He would be honored, revered, consulted for his wisdom, and deployed when the chapter faced its greatest threats. They did not tell him about the loneliness. They did not mention how it would feel to watch generation after generation of battle brothers grow old and die, while he remained unchanging in his metal shell. They did not explain the slow erosion of memory that would come with each cycle of sleep and awakening, the way his past would become increasingly dreamlike and uncertain. And they certainly did not warn him that one day, 4,500 years in the future, he would wake up not in the sacred halls of his chapter, but in the presence of the galaxy's most enthusiastic maniacs. The first few centuries were, in their own way, manageable. Meridius was deployed in 17 major campaigns, each time proving his worth as both warrior and tactical advisor. He saved the chapter from defeat on Carthago 7, held the line single-handedly at the Siege of Fortunus, and personally dueled an Ork war boss to death during the Battle of Meridian's Gate. Between battles he slept, and though each awakening was disorienting, he could still recognize faces, still remember names, still feel some connection to the chapter he served. But then came the long sleep. The Crimson Castellans were deployed to the Eastern Fringe on what was supposed to be a 5-year campaign to reclaim a lost sector from Xenos influence. They brought everything, their entire chapter fleet, all 10 companies, every piece of equipment they could muster, and they brought their dreadnoughts, including Brother Ancient Meridius. The fleet had barely entered the warp when disaster struck. No one knows exactly what happened. Perhaps the navigators miscalculated. Perhaps they encountered a warp storm. Perhaps something in the Imperium took offense to their presence. Whatever the cause, the fleet was scattered across time and space. Some ships were lost entirely, consumed by the warp, or thrown so far off course that they would never be recovered. Others emerged years or decades from when they should have, in completely different sectors of space. And one ship, the strike cruiser Eternal Vigilance, which carried Meridius and 3 other dreadnoughts, never emerged at all. It drifted in the warp, its Geller fields somehow still intact, despite the impossibility of that circumstance, for 4,000 years. Everything organic aboard died within the first century, crew and space marines alike, unable to survive the weird temporal effects and the slow degradation of the ship's life support. But the dreadnoughts, sealed in their armored sarcophagi, protected by stasis fields that kept them in a state between life and death, endured. Their consciousness was turned off, their systems locked down, their existence reduced to the bare minimum needed to preserve the organic components within. And then, as mysteriously as it had been lost, the Eternal Vigilance was found. Not by the Imperial Navy, not by explorers from the Adeptus Mechanicus, but by the Greenskins. A massive space hulk, a conglomeration of dozens of wrecked ships fused together by the forces of the warp, had absorbed the Eternal Vigilance into its structure. And now that space hulk, filled with Orks, who used it as both transport and mobile fortress, had dropped out of the warp near an Imperial world, and the Greenskins were preparing to launch their attack. The Green Tide. Understanding the Orks. Before we witness the moment of discovery, we need to understand exactly what the Orks are, because they represent something unique in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. While other factions in the galaxy fight for survival, for glory, for ideology, or out of hunger, the Orks fight for the sheer joy of it. They are, in many ways, the most honest faction in Warhammer 40k. They want to fight, they love to fight, and they will fight anyone, anywhere, anytime, including each other if no better opposition is available. But there is far more to the Orks than simple-minded violence. These creatures are the degraded descendants of the Krork, a race of super soldiers created by the ancient Old Ones during the War in Heaven millions of years ago. The Krork were sophisticated warriors, standing nearly 12 meters tall, clad in advanced armor, and capable of coordinating on a level that would put modern space marine tactics to shame. What we now call Orks are the remnants of that grand design, reduced in stature and intelligence, but retaining the biological advantages that made the Krork such effective weapons. Orks are parts fungus, part animal, a biological chimera that reproduces through spores released when they die. This means that any planet the Orks conquer is forever infected with their presence. Even if every adult Ork is killed, the spores they released will eventually grow into new Orks, creating a never-ending cycle of infestation. the spores first produce smaller orkoid life forms, snotlings, tiny creatures that tend to fungal gardens. Gretchen, slightly larger beings that serve as laborers and cannon fodder. And finally, full-grown orks, each one born with genetic knowledge programmed into their DNA. This genetic programming is what makes orks so dangerous despite their apparent primitiveness. An ork doesn't need to learn how to speak its language, how to fight, or how to operate weapons. These skills are hardwired into its genetic code, emerging naturally as the ork grows. More impressively, certain orks called odd boys possess specialized genetic knowledge. Mech boys understand mechanical principles at an instinctive level, able to build and repair technology without formal training. Pain boys serve as surgeons and medics, capable of performing complex operations with crude tools and complete disregard for sanitary procedures. Weird boys are natural psychers, channeling the psychic energy of nearby orks into devastating attacks. But perhaps the most important aspect of ork biology is the wah itself. This is not just a war cry or a military campaign, though it is both those things. The wag is a psychic gestalt field generated by orks when they gather in large numbers. This field has tangible effects on reality. It makes ork technology function beyond what should be physically possible. It increases the strength and intelligence of every ork it touches. And it draws more orks to the source, creating a feedback loop where success breeds more success, power attracts more power, and a small ork raiding party can snowball into a full-scale invasion that threatens entire sectors. The whack field is why ork technology works at all, because by any reasonable standard it shouldn't. An ork shooter is typically little more than scrap metal welded into a vaguely gun-shaped object with a firing mechanism that would be more likely to explode than shoot if used by anyone else. There are documented cases of Imperial forces capturing ork weapons, only to find that the magazines are filled with nothing but an empty shell casing and some nuts and bolts. The weapon worked for the ork because enough orks believed it would work, and their collective psychic field made that belief reality. Red vehicles go faster not because of any aerodynamic improvements, but because orks believe that red is the fastest color, and the whack makes it so. This brings us to the orks' legendary love of looting. While other factions might salvage enemy equipment out of necessity, orks do it with enthusiasm bordering on religious fervor. Mech boys will pay handsomely in teeth, the ork currency, for interesting pieces of technology. Entire clans, like the Death Skulls, have built their identity around scavenging and appropriating anything that isn't nailed down, and quite a few things that are. Lehman Russ tanks, Rhino transports, even Titans have been liberated by enterprising orks, painted in garish colors, covered with spikes and glyphs, and sent back into battle against their former owners. The process of orkifying looted equipment is both destructive and strangely reverent. Mech boys will tear apart Imperial technology, adding their own improvements with complete disregard for the original design. Firing mechanisms are modified to produce more noise and smoke, because what's the point of a gun if it doesn't sound proper loud? Armor is reinforced with scrap metal welded at random angles, creating a patchwork appearance that somehow still provides effective protection. Weapons are mounted wherever there's space, often in configurations that would be considered impossible by Imperial engineers, and yet somehow these modifications not only work, but often make the vehicle more dangerous than it was in Imperial hands. Ork society itself is brutally simple. The biggest and strongest ork is in charge, period. If you think you're bigger and stronger, you challenge him, and if you win, you're the new boss. This creates a hierarchy based purely on physical dominance, with the war boss at the top, followed by his nobs, the biggest and meanest orks in the warband, and then the vast mass of boys who make up the bulk of ork forces. Specialty mobs like Storm Boys, who use jump packs and are suspiciously disciplined for orks, or looters, who specialize in scavenging the best weapons from battlefields, exist throughout this hierarchy. Different orc clans have different cultures and specializations. The Goths are brutal close combat enthusiasts who paint everything black and favor choppy weapons over shooters. The Evil Sons are speed freaks obsessed with racing and painting everything red. The Bad Moons are the richest orcs, their teeth growing faster than other orcs, allowing them to afford the biggest and best weapons. The Blood Axes are cunning tacticians who even sometimes work with humans, earning them the distrust of other orcs. The Death Skulls, as mentioned, are scavengers who believe that blue is the luckiest color. And the Snakebites are traditionalists who shun modern technology in favor of squigs and other creatures. What makes orcs truly terrifying is not their individual power, though an orc knob can easily tear a human apart with its bare hands, but their numbers and their enthusiasm. They reproduce through spores, meaning that every battle that kills orcs creates more orcs in the long term. They love fighting so much that defeat only makes them want to come back for another go. And when enough of them gather under a powerful war boss, they create a wah that can threaten entire sectors, an unstoppable green tide that overwhelms defenses through sheer weight of numbers, firepower, and psychotic determination. This is what awaits our sleeping Dreadnought. Not a careful recovery team of tech priests with the proper rituals and equipment, not battle brothers eager to hear wisdom from an ancient, but a mob of greenskins who see a big metal thing covered in interesting gubbins and immediately want to either loot it or crump it, preferably both. The collision between these two forces, ancient imperial technology and orc enthusiasm, is about to create a situation that neither side could have predicted, and both will remember, assuming any of them survive. The Discovery, when scrap meets ancient glory. The space hulk known as De Eternal Scrap Heap to its orc inhabitants was a massive conglomeration of wrecked starships, asteroids, and space debris that had been fused together over centuries of drifting through the warp. It was home to several thousand orcs under war boss Skull Guzzler, a massive Goth who had claimed leadership by virtue of being the biggest and most successful fighter in the mob. The Hulk provided everything the orcs needed: shelter from the void, a mobile base of operations, and endless amounts of scrap to loot and repurpose. Every few years or decades, the Hulk would drop out of the warp near some inhabited system, and the orcs would pour forth in their ramshackle assault craft, eager for battle and plunder. The discovery of the Eternal Vigilance happened during one of the mob's routine scavenging operations. 3 orcs, 2 boys named Gricker and Thraka, and a young mech boy called Scrapzog, were exploring a section of the Hulk that had recently been opened when a warp shift caused several ships to crack apart and reveal new passages. This was always exciting for the orcs, as new sections meant new loot that hadn't been picked over by other mobs. The trio made their way through twisted corridors of fused metal, past the frozen corpses of Imperial crew who had died when their ship was pulled into the Hulk, deeper into the mechanical maze. Gricker, the larger of the 2 boys, carried a shooter he had looted from a previous battle, a weapon that was more rust than metal, but which he insisted still worked fine. Thraka had a massive chopper, a cleaver-like blade attached to a rocket motor that made it roar satisfyingly when activated. Scrapzog, still young by orc standards but already showing the mechanical aptitude that marked him as a mech boy, carried a collection of tools and was constantly stopping to examine interesting bits of machinery they passed. The air in this section of the Hulk was stale and cold, the life support systems having failed millennia ago. Patches of frost covered the walls where water vapor had frozen in the void-like temperatures. The orcs' natural hardiness allowed them to survive in conditions that would kill most other species, though Gricker did complain about the cold making his trigger finger stiff. They had been exploring for several hours, finding little of interest beyond some corroded weapons and a few pieces of scrap metal that Scrapzog marked for later retrieval. Then they turned a corner and found themselves in what had once been the strike cruiser's vehicle bay. The vast chamber was mostly empty, its contents having been torn away when the ship was absorbed into the Hulk. But against the far wall, secured in place by massive clamps and covered in a thick layer of frost, stood four objects that made all three orcs stop in their tracks. Even without understanding exactly what they were looking at, the greenskins recognized the shapes as something significant, something dangerous, something absolutely pro-par for Crumpin. Dreadnoughts, four of them, each one a towering war machine bearing the markings of the Crimson Castellans. Three were standard Castroferrum pattern dreadnoughts, their boxy frames covered in purity seals and honor markings. But the fourth, the one that immediately drew Scrapzog's attention, was different. It was larger, more streamlined, its armor more elegant despite the layers of frost. A Contemptor pattern dreadnought, a relic from the Great Crusade itself, its armored hull painted in the red and gold of the Crimson Castellans, its weapons maglocked to its arms in preparation for deployment that never came. "What's that?" Gricker asked, his simple mind struggling to process the sight before him. He had seen Space Marines before, had even killed a few during a raid on an Imperial outpost, but he had never seen anything like this. The massive war machines looked like they were sleeping, frost-covered giants waiting for someone to wake them up. "Dunno," Thraka replied, his grip tightening on his chopper, "but it looks proper hard. Bet it's got lots of good gubbins inside." Scrapzog was already moving forward, his mechanical instincts overriding any caution. He approached the Contemptor with the reverent awe that mech boys reserved for truly impressive pieces of technology. Even covered in frost and clearly ancient, the dreadnought radiated power and craftsmanship that made Scrapzog's fingers itch to start taking it apart. He placed his hand on the armored hull, feeling the cold metal through his thick green skin. "This is Imperial work," he said, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. "Really old Imperial work. Look at the way they put the armor on, and the weapons. Core, I bet they's a shoot real good." The Contemptor was armed with a twin-linked heavy bolter on its right arm and a massive dreadnought close combat weapon on its left, a power fist capable of crushing tanks. Mounted on its shoulders were additional weapons systems, hurricane bolters designed to shred infantry at close range. Even inactive and covered in frost, it looked like it could wake up and start killing at any moment, which, unknown to the Orks, was closer to the truth than they realized. "Can we loot it?" Gricker asked. The eternal question of Orks everywhere. If something existed, it could be looted. If it could be looted, it should be looted. And if someone said you couldn't loot it, you should crump them and loot it anyway. Scrapzog circled the dreadnought, examining it from every angle. His genetic knowledge told him this was advanced technology, far beyond what most Orks could create. But it also told him that it was a machine, and machines could be understood, taken apart, and repurposed. The question was how to get it out of its clamps and back to his workshop, and more importantly, how to keep the other mech boys from stealing it before he could claim it for himself. "Yeah, we can loot it," he said finally. "But we gonna need more boys. This thing is massive, and I ain't sure how to get it off the wall with just us three. Plus, we gotta be careful. See those lights on the front? Some of them are blinking. Real slow, but they're blinking. Means it might still be working." This was the moment where a more cautious species might have backed away, might have reported the find to authorities and waited for experts to handle the situation carefully. But Orks are not a cautious species, and the concept of "leave it to the experts" exists only in the sense that mech boys are the experts, and everyone else should let them handle the mechanical stuff. Thraka was already backing up, saying he'd go get more boys to help move it. Gricker was examining the other three dreadnoughts, wondering if they might wake up and start shooting. And Scrapzog, his curiosity overwhelming his common sense, was looking for a way to activate it. He traced power conduits along the dreadnought's frame, following them to a control panel on the wall behind the clamps. The panel was covered in Imperial Gothic script, which Scrapzog couldn't read, and filled with buttons, switches, and dials that meant nothing to him. But he was a mech boy, and mech boys understood machines instinctively. He studied the panel for a few moments, his genetically programmed knowledge telling him which parts conducted power and which were control mechanisms. "I think," he said slowly, "I think this is how you wake it up. See this big red button? Red means go faster, so if I push it... "Don't push the button!" Gricker shouted. But it was too late. Scrapzog's thick green finger had already pressed down on what was, in fact, the emergency activation switch for all 4 dreadnoughts. A switch that had been installed to wake the war machines in case the ship was boarded and needed immediate defense. A switch that had not been pressed in 4,500 years, but which, thanks to the incredible durability of Imperial technology and the strange properties of the warp, still functioned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the Contemptor, systems that had been dormant for millennia began to wake. Power cells that should have been dead after so long without maintenance miraculously held charge. Stasis fields that had kept their organic cargo preserved flickered off. Life support systems engaged, flooding the sarcophagus with fresh fluids. And somewhere in the center of all that metal and machinery, a consciousness that had been dreaming of past glories and ancient battles began to stir. Brother Ancient Meridius of the Crimson Castellans was awakening, and he was not happy. The awakening. Consciousness returns to ancient steel. Inside the sarcophagus, Meridius became aware of sensation returning in a way that he had not experienced in longer than he could comprehend. The first thing that came back was not sight or sound, but a vague sense of existence. A tiny spark of consciousness pushing through layers of darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. He had been asleep before, many times, but this felt different. This felt like waking from death itself, like his very soul was being dragged back from whatever peaceful void it had found during his long slumber. Then came the pain. Not physical pain, for he no longer had a body capable of feeling such things, but the burning agony of neural interfaces reactivating all at once. Thousands of connections between his brain and the Dreadnought systems sparked to life, each one feeling like a white-hot needle being driven into his consciousness. He tried to scream, but the Vox systems were not yet online. He tried to move, but his motor controls were still initializing. He was trapped in a moment of pure sensation without context, pain without purpose, existence without understanding. Slowly, agonizingly, his systems came online. First came basic awareness. He could feel the weight of the Dreadnought around him, the familiar sensation of being entombed in metal that had become his constant companion through his service. Then came his senses, one by one. Optical sensors flickered to life, showing him a view of the world through targeting reticles and threat assessment displays. Acoustic sensors brought him the sounds of the universe, though they were muffled and strange after so long in silence. Pressure sensors across his armor told him about temperature, atmosphere, and the presence of nearby objects. But something was wrong. His last clear memory was of the chapter's fortress monastery, of being returned to the Hall of Ancients after a successful campaign against heretics. He remembered the ritual of deactivation, the litanies of rest that the chaplain sang over him, the gradual dimming of his consciousness as the stasis field engaged. That was normal. That was how it always went. Sleep, then awakening when the chapter needed him again. But this was different. The date, the internal chronometer in his systems, still running despite everything, told him the date. 4,500 years had passed since his last activation. That was impossible. The Crimson Castellans would never have left him in stasis that long. Even the most ancient of dreadnoughts were awakened regularly to provide counsel and maintain the living connection between past and present. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. His optical sensors, now fully online, showed him his surroundings. This was not the Hall of Ancients. It was not even a proper Imperial facility. The chamber around him was dark, cold, and covered in frost. Frost. In space. He was still secured in deployment clamps, suggesting he had never been deployed from what? He attempted to access his databanks, to recall his last mission, but found gaps in his memory. The long sleep had done something to his recall. He could remember his battles, remember his brothers, but the sequence of events, the context that gave them meaning, was fragmented and uncertain. Then his sensors detected movement. 3 large figures, 7 to 8 feet tall, heavily muscled, green skin visible even in the low light. Orks. 3 orks were in the chamber with him, and one of them, the smallest of the 3, was standing right in front of him, thick fingers still pressed against a control panel. The realization hit Meridius like a lance strike. The orks had awakened him. The orks had found him, and given what he could see of his surroundings, this was not an Imperial ship, or if it was, it had been captured by the greenskins. Rage flooded through him, hot and pure. After 45 centuries of service, after battles beyond counting, after sacrifices that would have broken lesser warriors, he had been reduced to this. A piece of salvage for Xenos scavengers. A trophy to be looted by creatures so primitive they couldn't even build proper technology without their psychic field holding it together. The insult was unforgivable. The dishonor was intolerable. And these 3 orks, these pathetic examples of the greenskin menace, were about to learn why the Adeptus Astartes were called the Emperor's Angels of Death. His vox systems crackled to life, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder after a long silence. When he spoke, his voice was the grinding mechanical roar of a dreadnought, but beneath it, centuries of fury and determination gave his words a weight that transcended the artificial nature of their production. "Xenos," he rumbled, each word measured and terrible. "You have made a grave mistake." The 3 orks jumped at the sound, Gricker and Thraka stumbling backward in surprise. Scrapzog, to his credit, held his ground, though his eyes widened as he stared at the dreadnought. The machine was still locked in its clamps, its weapons mag-locked and unpowered, but the pure menace radiating from it made even the enthusiastically violent orks pause. "It talks," Thraka said, his chopper held ready, but his stance uncertain. "What do we do?" "I am brother ancient Meridius of the Crimson Castellans," the dreadnought continued, his targeting systems automatically locking onto each ork in turn. His weapons were unpowered, he couldn't break free of his clamps yet, but his sensor suite was still functional, and every ork movement was being tracked and analyzed. "I have served the Emperor for 45 centuries. I have destroyed enemies of mankind beyond counting. And you dare to lay your filthy Xenos hands upon my sarcophagus." Scrapzog's mind was racing. This was not just a big gun with legs. This was something alive, something intelligent, something that had just told them it had been killing things for longer than most orc clans had existed. But it was also the most amazing piece of technology he had ever seen. And his mechboy instincts were screaming at him that if he could just figure out how it worked, he could build something incredible. "Look, mate," Scrapzog said, his common sense fighting a losing battle against his curiosity. "We didn't know you was awake. We just found you here, all frozen and stuck to the wall. We was just gonna take you apart, see how you work. No offense meant." "No offense?" Meridius's rage reached new heights. Being looted would have been insulting enough. Being looted and dismantled like some piece of common machinery was beyond tolerance. You would defile the blessed form of a servant of the Emperor. You would tear apart a hero of the Imperium like scrap metal. Power was flooding through Meridius's systems now. His reactor, dormant for so long, was warming up. His weapons were initializing, running through diagnostic checks. His limbs were testing their hydraulics, preparing for movement. The deployment clamps holding him to the wall were built to secure dreadnoughts during transport, but they were never meant to hold against a dreadnought actively trying to break free. And Meridius, fueled by 4,500 years of pent-up fury and indignation at his circumstances, was very much trying to break free. The clamps began to groan under the strain. Warning lights flickered on the control panel as the system detected unexpected stress. Gricker and Thraka were backing away now, realizing that whatever they had awakened was about to become a much bigger problem. But Scrapzog remained, transfixed by the sight of the ancient war machine coming to full activation. This was the most exciting thing that had happened to him since he had accidentally blown up his workshop while trying to make a better bomb. "You will release me," Meridius commanded, his voice now supplemented by warning klaxons as his weapon systems came online. The heavy bolter on his right arm was loaded and ready. The power fist on his left arm was crackling with barely contained energy. The hurricane bolters on his shoulders were cycling through their ammunition feeds. "Release me now, or I will tear my way free and reduce this entire section to scrap." For once in his life, Scrapzog was faced with a choice that actually required thought. He could try to keep the Dreadnought contained, which would probably result in his death and the destruction of this amazing technology. He could run away, which would disappoint all the other mech boys and prove he wasn't tough enough to handle scary situations. Or he could do something really stupid that might, just might, work out in a way that would make him look like a genius. He chose option 3. Because Scrapzog, like all orcs, was fundamentally incapable of choosing the sensible option when a more exciting alternative presented itself. He reached up to the control panel, found what his mech boy instincts told him was the release mechanism, and pulled it. The clamps disengaged with a hydraulic hiss. 4,500 years of confinement ended in an instant. And brother Ancient Meridius, last survivor of the Crimson Castellan's lost fleet, hero of battles now forgotten by history, took his first free step in longer than some imperial dynasties had existed. What happened next would be remembered in orc legends as "the time Scrapzog woke up to Killy Metal Thing," and in the tattered memory banks of a Dreadnought as the day everything went wrong again. First contact, when ancient fury meets orc enthusiasm. Meridius' first action upon breaking free from his clamps was not measured or tactical. It was pure, concentrated rage given physical form. His power fist swung in a wide arc, the energy field surrounding it crackling with barely contained power. Thraka, who had been the closest orc besides Scrapzog, had just enough time to raise his chopper in a desperate block before the power fist connected. The result was catastrophic for Thraka. The power fist tore through his weapon like it was made of wet paper, continued through his raised arms, and smashed into his torso with enough force to send the orc flying backward through the air. He hit the far wall with a wet crunch, leaving a green smear on the frost-covered metal, his body broken beyond even orc resilience to repair. Thraka was dead before he hit the ground, the first casualty of what would become a very bloody encounter. Gricker, demonstrating the survival instincts that had kept him alive this long, immediately turned and ran. He had no illusions about fighting this metal monster. He had seen what it did to Thraka, and Thraka had been bigger and tougher than him. The only sensible course of action was to get as far away as possible and find other boys to help crump this thing, preferably lots of other boys, with big guns. Meridius tracked Gricker's retreat with his targeting systems, his heavy bolter swinging around to acquire the fleeing orc. The weapon's machine spirit, awakened alongside its master, was eager for blood. Mass reactive shells loaded into the chamber. Targeting solutions calculated. Distance, wind speed, even the slight tilt of the deck under his feet, all factored into the firing solution. And then the heavy bolter spoke, its thunder echoing through the vehicle bay like the voice of an angry god. Mass reactive bolter shells are designed to penetrate armor before detonating inside the target, making them devastating against armored enemies. Against an unarmored orc running in a straight line, they were simply overkill. The first shell caught Gricker in the lower back, penetrating his tough skin before exploding inside his body cavity. The second and third shells, fired in the same burst, were technically unnecessary as Gricker was already dead, but they ensured that what remained of the orc was scattered across a wide area of the vehicle bay. Silence fell, broken only by the hum of Meridius's systems and the quiet dripping of various orc fluids. 2 orcs, dead in less than 10 seconds. A good start, Meridius thought, but hardly satisfying. These had been mere boys, small and weak by orc standards, no challenge for a dreadnought of his caliber. He turned his optical sensors to Scrapzog, the mech boy who had freed him, who had stood frozen in place throughout the brief violence. "Your turn, Xenos," Meridius said, his power fist still crackling with energy as he took a thunderous step toward the mech boy. The deck plates groaned under his weight, frost shattering and falling from his armor as he moved. "Any last words before I crush you?" Scrapzog, staring at the towering war machine bearing down on him, came to a realization that would change his life forever. This thing, this ancient metal warrior, was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. It had just killed 2 boys without even trying, had weapons that worked perfectly despite being older than any orc tribe Scrapzog knew, and was held together with craftsmanship that made him want to weep with joy. He didn't want to fight it. He wanted to understand it. He wanted to take it apart and learn its secrets. And if he couldn't do that, he at least wanted to watch it crump stuff for a while longer. "Wait!" Scrapzog held up his hands, tools clattering as he dropped them in a gesture that he hoped would be interpreted as non-threatening. "I let you out, right? I freed you. That's got to count for something." Meridius paused. His tactical systems, finally fully online after their long dormancy, were feeding him threat assessments and strategic options. The mech boy posed minimal immediate threat. Killing him would be trivial. But the orc's words raised a valid point. Scrapzog had released him from the clamps when he could have kept Meridius imprisoned or run away. Whether out of curiosity, stupidity, or some other motive, the mech boy had technically aided him, even if the orc had also been responsible for Meridius's situation in the first place. More importantly, Meridius needed information. He had been asleep for 4.5 millennia. The galaxy could have changed in countless ways. His chapter might not even exist anymore. The Imperium itself might have fallen. And while the idea of cooperation with Xenos was abhorrent, the idea of operating in complete ignorance was even worse. An Astartes, even one entombed in a Dreadnought, was supposed to be flexible in his tactics. And right now, tactical flexibility meant not immediately killing the only source of information available. "Explain," Meridius commanded, his power fist still raised, but not striking. "Where am I? What has happened to my ship? And why should I not simply kill you and find my own answers?" Scrapdog's mind raced. He was in the most dangerous situation of his life, which, considering he was an orc, was saying something. But he was also potentially in the most opportunity-rich situation of his life. If he could somehow convince this metal murder machine not to kill him, he might learn how it worked. And if he could learn how it worked, he could build his own, or modify it. Or at the very least, he'd have the best story to tell at the next mech gathering. "Right, so, the way I figure it," Scrapzog began, his words tumbling out fast. "You've been asleep for a really long time, yeah? Longer than any orc I know been alive. You were stuck on that ship," he pointed to the wall behind the Dreadnought, "and that ship got stuck in this space hulk. This whole place is just a bunch of old ships that got smashed together into warp. We orcs use it to get around, see? It drops out of the warp near planets. We go crump stuff and loot stuff. Then we come back and wait for the hulk to take us somewhere else." Meridius processed this information, his databanks comparing it against what he knew of orc behavior and space hulk phenomena. It was plausible. Space hulks were dangerous conglomerations of lost ships that drifted in and out of the warp unpredictably. Many orc wags used them as transport, taking advantage of their size and durability to carry entire armies across the galaxy. If his ship had been trapped in the warp and then absorbed into such a hulk, it would explain both his long sleep and his current location. "And my chapter?" Meridius asked, the question carrying more weight than any of his weapons. "The Crimson Castellans, do they still exist?" Scrapzog's expression shifted, something almost like regret crossing his face. "Dunno, mate. Never heard of them. But it don't mean nothing. There's lots of Space Marine chapters, and we orcs don't really keep track of them all. Could be they're still out there somewhere. Could be they got crumped. Hard to say." The possibility that his chapter no longer existed hit Meridius harder than any physical blow could have. For 45 centuries, he had defined himself by his service to the Crimson Castellans. Every battle, every sacrifice, every moment of endurance through the hell of Dreadnought existence had been in service to his brothers and the chapter's legacy. The idea that all of that might be gone, that he might be the last remnant of a chapter that had been destroyed while he slept, was almost unbearable. But he was Adeptus Astartes. He had been trained to endure unbearable things. He had been forged into a weapon that knew no doubt, no despair, no weakness. His chapter might be gone, but the Imperium remained. The Emperor still sat upon the golden throne, and while there was breath in his body, or whatever passed for breath when you were a brain in a jar, he would serve. "Then I will find them," Meridius declared, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I will locate my chapter, or failing that, I will offer my service to another. But first, I must escape this hulk and reach Imperial space. Which means..." He turned his full attention back to Scrapzog. "I need to get off this ship. Tell me, mech, how does one navigate a space hulk?" Scrapzog realized he was being offered something unexpected. A deal. The scary metal thing wasn't going to kill him immediately if he helped. This was good. This was potentially very good. Of course, it was also potentially very bad if the war boss found out he was helping an enemy instead of looting it. But Scrapzog had always believed that you should worry about today's problems today and tomorrow's problems never. "Well," Scrapzog said carefully, "it ain't easy. The hulk is big, real big. Lots of corridors and rooms and bits that don't connect to other bits. And it's full of orcs, probably thousands of them by now. You'd have to fight your way through all of them to reach the landing bays. And even then, you'd need a ship what works. And most of our ships are pretty shoddily made, if I'm being honest." Meridius considered this. Thousands of orcs between him and escape. In his prime, as a flesh and blood captain, that would have been a daunting prospect. But he was no longer a mere space marine. He was a dreadnought, a walking war machine designed to turn the tide of battles single-handedly. And these were orcs, not Chaos Marines or Xenos horrors. Dangerous, yes, but not invincible. "Then we will fight through them," Meridius said with finality. "But I require intelligence, layouts, enemy strength, critical choke points. Can you provide this, or are you merely wasting my time?" Scrapzog's mind was spinning with possibilities. Going with this dreadnought meant danger, absolutely, but it also meant watching it fight, learning how its weapons worked, maybe even getting to poke around inside if it got damaged. And if he was helping it escape, maybe it wouldn't kill him afterward. It was a long shot, but Scrapzog had built a career on long shots. "I can help," Scrapzog said, "but we got a problem. See, I pushed that button what woke you up, and that means I woke up your mates too." He pointed to the other 3 dreadnoughts, which were beginning to show signs of activation, lights flickering on, servos whining as they tested movement. "And I ain't sure if they're going to be as chatty as you." Meridius turned his sensors to his fellow dreadnoughts, seeing them for the first time since awakening. Brothers, fellow ancients of the Crimson Castellans, warriors who had served alongside him through countless battles. They were waking up, just as he had, confused and disoriented after 4,000 years of sleep. They would need guidance, explanation, leadership. And as the highest-ranking officer among them, having been a captain before his internment, that responsibility fell to him. "Brothers," he called out, his vox amplified to reach them. "This is Brother Ancient Meridius. We have been awakened aboard an Orc space hulk. Stand down until I can brief you on our situation. That is an order." The response was not immediate, and when it came, it was not entirely reassuring. One of the 3 dreadnoughts, Brother Ancient Thaddeus, responded with a mechanical growl that suggested his higher cognitive functions were not yet online. Another, Brother Ancient Castus, managed a confused inquiry about why everything hurt. The third, Brother Ancient Davius, remained silent, his systems still cycling through activation protocols. This was going to be more complicated than Meridius had hoped. But then again, when had anything in his service to the Emperor been simple? He had awakened in the custody of Orks 4,000 years after he should have, with no knowledge of whether his chapter still existed, and now he had to guide 3 other dreadnoughts through this crisis while using an Ork mech boy as a guide. It was, quite possibly, the most absurd situation he had ever faced. And somewhere deep in his consciousness, in the part of him that was still human despite everything, Brother Ancient Meridius realized something surprising. After 4.5 millennia of existence, he finally felt truly alive again. He had a mission. He had enemies to fight. And he had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. For a warrior who had spent centuries in predictable cycles of sleep and awakening, the uncertainty was almost refreshing. "Very well, Mech," he said to Scrapdog. "You will guide us to the landing bays. In return, I will not kill you, yet. Should you betray us or prove useless, this mercy will be immediately revoked. Do you understand?" Scrapzog nodded vigorously. "Understood, boss. Ancient boss. Big metal bossman. Whatever you want me to call you. Meridius will suffice. Now move. My brothers will need several more minutes to fully activate, and I prefer to put distance between us and this location before more Orks arrive to investigate the noise we have made." It was sound, tactical thinking, but it was already too late. The sounds of Meridius killing 2 Orks and arguing with Scrapzog had not gone unnoticed. Even now, drawn by the gunfire and the mechanical thunder of the Dreadnought's voice, more Orks were approaching. Some were curious about what the noise was. Others had heard Scrapzog shouting and wanted to see what he had found. And a few, the most dangerous ones, had heard the distinctive sound of a heavy bolter firing and were coming specifically because they wanted to fight whatever had made that sound. Meridius's sensors detected them first. Multiple contacts moving through the corridors toward the vehicle bay. 20 Orks, maybe 30, armed with a mixture of shooters, choppers, and whatever else they had been able to loot or build. Led by a Nob, one of the bigger and meaner Orks, who was shouting orders and working the mob into a proper fighting frenzy. "Contacts," Meridius announced, his weapon systems automatically tracking toward the approaching mob. 30 plus Xenos, approaching from corridor B7. Time to contact, 45 seconds. Scrapzog's eyes widened. "That's Big Maggot's mob. He's gonna be real upset about you killing his boys." "Then he should not have sent them to disturb my rest," Meridius replied, positioning himself between the corridor entrance and his still awakening brothers. "Take cover, Mech. This is about to become extremely loud." And with that, Brother Ancient Meridius of the Crimson Castellans, last survivor of a lost fleet, veteran of 45 centuries of warfare, prepared to do what he did best. He prepared to kill Orks. Lots and lots of Orks. The Battle of the Vehicle Bay was about to begin. The storm breaks. Battle in the Vehicle Bay. The Orks came around the corner in a green tide, their collective roar echoing through the metal corridors like a physical force. Big Maggot, the Nob leading them, was at the front, his massive frame clad in mismatched armor plates looted from a dozen different sources. He carried a huge chain axe in one hand and a custom shooter in the other, the latter more or less held together with faith, rust, and Ork belief. Behind him came his mob, 30 boys eager for a fight, each one clutching weapons and howling battle cries in that peculiar mix of enthusiasm and bloodlust that characterized Ork warfare. They expected to find Scrapzog tinkering with some piece of machinery, maybe fighting over loot with Gricker and Threcker. What they found instead was a scene that would haunt even Ork nightmares, if Orks were capable of having nightmares. In the center of the vehicle bay stood a towering war machine of ancient design, its armor painted in colors they didn't recognize, but which spoke of authority and power. Around it lay the remains of 2 Orks, scattered across the deck in ways that made it very clear how they had died. And standing next to the war machine was Scrapzog, apparently very much alive and apparently having a conversation with it. The sight was so unexpected that Big Maggot actually paused, which was unusual for an Ork confronted with something he didn't understand. The pause lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was long enough for his limited tactical thinking to process the situation and come to the only conclusion that made sense to an orc mind. That thing had killed his boys, and now it was going to get crumped. "Get the big metal thing!" Big Maggot roared, raising his chain axe high. "Where?" The mob responded with their own battle cries, surging forward in that peculiar orc charge that combined reckless bravery with complete disregard for personal safety. Some raised their shooters and opened fire, filling the air with bullets that ranged from properly manufactured Imperial ammunition to what appeared to be bent nails and pieces of scrap metal. Others simply charged forward with choppers raised, eager to get stuck into close combat where a proper orc belonged. Meridius had been fighting orcs for 300 years before his internment. He knew their tactics, understood their psychology, and had developed very specific strategies for dealing with greenskin hordes. The key to fighting orcs was understanding that they operated on a completely different set of psychological principles than more civilized species. Fear didn't slow them down, it excited them. Casualties didn't demoralize them, they just made more room for the survivors to get stuck in. And the sight of a powerful enemy didn't make them cautious. It made them eager to prove they were tough enough to fight it. So Meridius didn't bother with intimidation or warnings. He simply opened fire. The heavy bolter on his right arm spoke first, its distinctive roar filling the vehicle bay as mass reactive shells tore into the orc mob. Each shell was designed to penetrate armor before exploding inside the target, and against unarmored orc flesh, they were devastatingly effective. The first burst caught 3 boys in a line, the shells punching through the first orc and continuing through to the second and third before detonating. What had been 3 orcs became a red and green mist hanging in the air, body parts falling to the deck with wet thuds. But Meridius didn't stop there. Even as the heavy bolter was cycling to its next burst, the hurricane bolters mounted on his shoulders opened up. These weapons were designed for close-range devastation, firing a storm of bolter shells at a rate that could shred infantry formations in seconds. The storm of fire tore into the orc mob like a physical wall, each shell finding green flesh and detonating with brutal efficiency. Orcs died. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, the sheer volume of fire overwhelming even their impressive resilience. Some tried to dive for cover, seeking shelter behind chunks of debris or the twisted metal of the vehicle bay's walls. Others simply kept charging, roaring defiance even as bolter shells tore them apart. A few managed to return fire, their shooters barking out streams of bullets that sparked harmlessly off Meridius's armor. And a brave or stupid few actually reached close combat range, choppers raised to strike at the Dreadnought's legs. Meridius met them with his power fist, the massive weapon, wreathed in a power field that disrupted molecular bonds, swung in a wide arc that caught 2 orcs at once. The result was spectacular and horrifying. The orcs didn't just die, they were obliterated, their bodies torn apart at the molecular level by the power field's effects. What remained was barely recognizable as having once been living creatures. The battle lasted perhaps 90 seconds from start to finish, but in that time, Meridius demonstrated exactly why dreadnoughts were considered some of the most dangerous weapons in the Imperial arsenal. When the firing finally stopped, when the last orc fell with a chopper still raised in futile defiance, the vehicle bay looked like an abattoir. Green blood and body parts covered every surface. The smell of burned flesh and ozone filled the air. And in the center of it all stood Meridius, his armor barely scratched, his weapons already cycling down to idle mode. Big Maggot, to his credit, had survived the initial barrage. The knob had been at the back of the mob when Meridius opened fire, and his armor had turned aside several bolter shells that would have killed a lesser orc. Now he stood alone, his mob dead around him, facing a war machine that had just effortlessly slaughtered 30 of his boys. Any sensible being would have retreated, called for reinforcements, or at least reconsidered their tactics. Big Maggot charged, with a roar that combined fury, despair, and a strange sort of joy that only an orc could feel when facing impossible odds. The knob threw himself at Meridius. His chain axe was roaring, its teeth blurring as they spun at maximum speed. His custom shooter was firing wildly, spraying bullets in Meridius's general direction with complete disregard for accuracy, and his voice was raised in a war cry that would have done credit to any Orc warlord.
"Wag!"
Big Maggot bellowed.
"Die, you git!"
Meridius almost admired the courage, even if it was born from Orc psychology rather than actual bravery. He waited until the knob was within striking range, let the chain axe bounce off his armor plating in a shower of sparks, and then swung his power fist in a precise, measured strike. The blow caught Big Maggot square in the center of mass, the power field tearing through his armor like paper. The knob had time for one final, surprised grunt before the power fist continued through his body and out the other side. His remains fell to either side of Meridius, joining the carnage that covered the vehicle bay floor. Silence fell, broken only by the hum of Meridius's systems and the dripping of various fluids. 31 Orcs dead in less than 2 minutes. A decent start to what Meridius suspected would be a very long and very violent escape attempt. He turned his optical sensors to where Scrapzog had taken cover behind a piece of debris, finding the mech boy staring at him with an expression that combined terror, respect, and unmistakable excitement. "You see that?" Scrapzog said to no one in particular. "You see how fast he killed him? Core, that was brilliant. The way the bullets went through him, and the way the power fist just smashed Big Maggot, and everything worked so smooth and proper." The mech boy trailed off, apparently overwhelmed by the technical perfection he had just witnessed. "Status," Meridius commanded, his sensors already scanning for additional threats. His databanks told him that Orc mobs typically traveled in larger groups, and the absence of more Orcs arriving to investigate the gunfire suggested either that this section of the hulk was relatively isolated, or that the other Orcs were currently occupied elsewhere. Neither option was comforting. "Well, good news and bad news," Scrapzog said, emerging from cover and carefully stepping around the carnage. "Good news is that corridor leads toward the main sections of the hulk, where all the landing bays and workshops are. Bad news is, between here and there is about 5,000 more Orcs, give or take a few hundred, and they're going to be real interested in who just killed Big Maggot's mob." Behind Meridius, the other 3 Dreadnoughts were now fully activated. Brother Ancient Thaddeus had managed to break free from his clamps and was surveying the battlefield with obvious satisfaction. Brother Ancient Castus was still struggling with motor control, his movements jerky and uncoordinated after so long in stasis. And Brother Ancient Davius had finally achieved full consciousness and was demanding an explanation for what in the Emperor's name was going on. Meridius took a moment to bring his brothers up to speed, his Vox channel set to a frequency that only the 4 Dreadnoughts could hear. He explained their situation, their location, and his plan to fight their way to a landing bay and escape this Orc-infested nightmare. The response was mixed. Thaddeus was eager to start killing Orcs immediately. Castus wanted more information about what had happened to the chapter. Davius suggested they should try to find an alternative route that didn't involve fighting through thousands of Orcs. "There is no alternative," Meridius told them. "We are on an Orc space hulk, 4,000 years after our last deployment, with no knowledge of whether our chapter still exists. Our options are to fight our way out, or to remain here until the Orcs either destroy us or dismantle us for parts. I choose the former. Who stands with me?" It was not really a question. As the senior officer, Meridius had the authority to give orders, and his brothers, despite any reservations they might have, would follow. That was what the Adeptus Astartes did. They followed orders, completed missions, and served the Emperor regardless of personal feelings or preferences. The fact that they were now trapped in metal bodies, thousands of years out of their proper time, and surrounded by hostile Xenos, didn't change that fundamental truth. "We stand with you," Thaddeus responded immediately. "Let these green skins learn why we are called the Emperor's finest." Castus and Davius added their own affirmations, and Meridius felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember: command, presence. For 4,500 years, he had been a weapon to be deployed, a tool to be used, a piece of equipment that gave advice but didn't make decisions. Now, suddenly, he was a leader again. He had brothers under his command, a mission to complete, and enemies to overcome. It was, in its own strange way, the closest thing to happiness he had felt since his internment. "Then we move," Meridius declared. "MEK, you will guide us. Brothers, prepare for
sustained combat." We advance through Corridor B7, proceeding toward the main hull sections. Any Ork that opposes us will be destroyed without mercy. This is no longer a simple extraction. This is war. And so began the March of the Ancients, as it would later be called in both Ork legends and what few Imperial records would eventually document this event. 4 dreadnoughts, guided by an Ork mech boy, who was either the bravest or stupidest greenskin in the galaxy, began their journey through a space hulk filled with thousands of Orks who had no idea what was about to hit them. It would be a march measured not in miles, but in body counts, not in hours, but in ammunition expended, a testament to what happened when ancient heroes of the Imperium faced the unending tide of the green menace. The Orks, for their part, were about to learn a very important lesson about waking up ancient warriors. Some lessons, it turns out, are best learned through direct experience, and some direct experiences are not survived. The march begins, corridor to corridor, combat. The first corridor after the vehicle bay was relatively narrow by Space Hulk standards, barely wide enough for 2 dreadnoughts to walk side by side. Meridius led the way, his sensors constantly scanning for threats while Scrapzog ran ahead, checking each intersection before waving the dreadnoughts forward. Behind Meridius came Thaddeus, then Castus, with Davius bringing up the rear and keeping his weapons trained backward in case of pursuit. They encountered their first resistance after advancing 300 meters. A mob of Ork boys, perhaps 15 strong, came around a corner directly ahead of them. There was a moment of mutual surprise as both groups recognized each other. And then the Orks did what Orks do best. They charged forward with absolutely no plan beyond get stuck in. Meridius didn't even slow down. His heavy bolter spoke once, a 3-second burst that turned the corridor into a killing ground. Bolter shells ricocheted off the metal walls before finding Ork flesh, and the narrow confines of the corridor meant that there was no room to dodge or take cover. When the firing stopped, there were no living Orks left, just corpses and body parts scattered across the deck. "Keep moving," Meridius ordered, stepping over the carnage without pause. Behind him, Thaddeus chuckled darkly, a sound that was disturbing coming from a dreadnought's Vox speakers. "Pathetic," Thaddeus commented. "I had hoped for more challenge." "Save your enthusiasm, brother," Meridius replied. "That was merely the first encounter. The real fighting has not yet begun." He was proven correct 30 seconds later when they reached a major intersection where 5 corridors converged. Scrapzog had been checking the routes ahead when he suddenly scrambled back, his eyes wide. "Big problem, boss. Really big problem. There's a whole bunch of Orks in the next section, and I think they know we're coming." Indeed, the sound of Ork, voices raised in excitement and anticipation, echoed from multiple directions. Meridius's sensors detected movement in at least 3 of the connecting corridors. 60, maybe 70 Orks, all converging on their position. This was no longer a chance encounter. The Orks had heard about the fighting in the vehicle bay and were actively hunting the intruders. "Standard formation," Meridius ordered. "Brothers, form a firing line. We hold this intersection and let them come to us. Make every shot count." The 4 dreadnoughts positioned themselves in a square formation, each facing a different corridor. Scrapzog wisely pressed himself against the wall in the center of the formation, as far from any line of fire as possible, and then they waited, weapons charged and targeting systems online, for the green tide to crash upon them. The Orks came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that suggested someone with more tactical sense than the average boy was directing them. Perhaps a nob, or even a war boss, had taken an interest in the intruders. Regardless of who was commanding them, the result was the same. Dozens of orcs pouring into the intersection from multiple angles, their weapons firing wildly, their voices raised in that characteristic orc war cry that combined enthusiasm, fury, and joy in equal measure. The dreadnoughts responded with disciplined fire that would have done credit to any Imperial Guard regiment. Heavy bolters barked in measured bursts, each burst calculated to maximize kills while conserving ammunition. Hurricane bolters swept corridors with storms of fire that left nothing alive in their wake. And when orcs managed to close to melee range, power fists swung with devastating effect, crushing skulls and shattering bones with casual brutality. But the orcs kept coming. For every one that fell, 2 more took its place, driven forward by the psychic resonance of the wah and their own natural enthusiasm for violence. They fired their shooters from the hip, spraying bullets in the general direction of the dreadnoughts, with complete disregard for accuracy or ammunition conservation. They threw crude grenades that exploded in showers of shrapnel, and they charged forward with choppers raised, determined to get stuck in, even if it meant climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades.
This is more like it,
Thaddeus roared, his heavy flamer adding to the destruction as he swept a gout of burning promethium across a charging mob. Orcs screamed as they burned, their natural toughness unable to save them from temperatures that could melt ceramite.
These Xenos have spirit at least.
They have stupidity, Castus corrected, methodically picking off orcs with his twin-linked Lascannon. The powerful energy weapon carved through multiple orcs with each shot, the laser punching clean through bodies and continuing to the next target. Any intelligent enemy would have retreated by now. Orcs are not known for their intelligence, Davius observed, his assault cannon reducing a particularly large mob to giblets. They compensate with numbers and enthusiasm, a dangerous combination, but not insurmountable. Meridius said nothing, focused entirely on target acquisition and fire discipline. His centuries of combat experience allowed him to read the flow of battle in ways his younger brothers couldn't. He noticed that while the orcs were charging forward with typical recklessness, there was a pattern to their assault. Someone was deliberately throwing more orcs at them from the left corridor, while keeping the right corridor relatively clear. Why would they do that unless—
"Ambush right!"
Meridius roared, spinning his massive frame to face the right corridor, just as a mob of orcs emerged from cover. But these weren't regular boys. These were looters, specialized orcs armed with heavy weapons scavenged from previous battles, and they were already firing, heavy stubbers and autocannons, sending a storm of fire toward the dreadnoughts. The heavier weaponry was actually capable of damaging dreadnought armor, and several rounds punched through Meridius's outer plating before he could return fire. Warning runes flashed in his consciousness as his armor's integrity dropped by 5%. Not serious, but concerning. If these orcs had heavy weapons, they might actually pose a threat. "Priority targets," Meridius commanded, his heavy bolter acquiring the looters and opening fire. "Heavy weapons first. Do not give them time to coordinate their fire." The battle continued for another 3 minutes, an eternity in combat terms. By the time it was over, the intersection was piled high with orc corpses, green blood flowing in rivers across the deck. The dreadnoughts had taken damage, mostly superficial, but enough to remind them that they were not invincible. And somewhere in the distance, the sounds of more orcs gathering could be heard, drawn by the noise of combat like sharks to blood. "Ammunition status," Meridius requested. 70%, Thaddeus reported. 65%, Castus added. 40%, Davius said, his assault cannon having consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. "I may need to conserve ammunition for critical encounters." Meridius ran calculations in his databanks. They had fought 2 significant engagements and were already down to about 2/3 of their ammunition on average. At this rate, they would run dry long before reaching the landing bays. They needed either a resupply, which was impossible on an Ork space hulk, or they needed to change their tactics to conserve ammunition. Neither option was ideal. "Oi, bossman!" Scrapzog spoke up from his position in the center of the formation. "I got an idea. Might be a stupid idea, might be brilliant, but it's an idea." "Speak," Meridius commanded. "Right, so, the way I see it, you's fighting every Ork that shows up, yeah? And there's a lot of Orks on this hulk, but most of them don't know what they're fighting yet. They just hear gunfire and come running to join in. So what if we make them scared to come at us? What if we show them something so terrifying that even Orks think twice about attacking?" It was, Meridius had to admit, an interesting proposition. Orks were naturally fearless, their biology making them almost immune to the kind of psychological warfare that worked on other species. But they weren't completely immune. There were things even Orks feared. The Inquisition's exterminatus actions, certain chaos entities, and perhaps most relevantly, enemies so overwhelmingly powerful that fighting them was clearly suicide. The problem was demonstrating that power in a way that would spread through the Ork mob before they reached the landing bays. And that required something dramatic, something that would be talked about and exaggerated through Ork storytelling until every greenskin on the hulk knew about the scary metal things that killed everything in their path. "What do you propose?" Meridius asked. Scrapzog's grin was wide and showed far too many teeth. "I propose we find the biggest mob we can, and you lot make such a mess of 'em that every Ork on this hulk hears about it. Not just kill 'em, but really crump 'em good. Make it proper, spectacular. Then let a few survivors run away to tell everyone else. Before you know it, Orks will be too scared to attack, or at least they'll think about it first." It was, Meridius reflected, either a terrible idea or a brilliant one, and he wasn't entirely sure which. But they were running low on ammunition and facing thousands more Orks between here and their objective. Psychological warfare might be their best option for reducing casualties and conserving resources. "Very well," he decided. "Where can we find this biggest mob?" Scrapzog thought for a moment. "Well, there's Warboss Skullguzzler's main camp. He's got maybe 500 boys there, all his best fighters, nobs, specialists, even a couple of deaf dreads. If you fought them and won, every Ork on the hulk would hear about it. 500 Orks, including nobs and deaf dreads. Even for 4 Dreadnoughts, that was a significant challenge. But Meridius had not survived 45 centuries of warfare by avoiding difficult battles. Sometimes, the boldest course of action was the only viable one. "Then that is where we go," he declared. "Brothers, prepare for sustained combat. We are about to teach these Orks the meaning of fear." And with that, the 4 Dreadnoughts and their unexpected Ork guide began moving deeper into the space hulk, toward what would become one of the bloodiest battles in the vessel's long and violent history. The greatest battle, confronting the Warboss. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into what happens when ancient Imperial glory meets Ork enthusiasm, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. We've got more Warhammer 40k content exploring the lore's strangest and most fascinating scenarios coming your way, and your support helps us continue bringing you these stories from the grim darkness of the far future. Now let's see how this epic confrontation concludes. The journey to Warboss Skullguzzler's camp took another hour of fighting through smaller Ork mobs, each one more persistent than the last. Word had spread through the hulk about the metal monsters killing everything in their path, and rather than deterring the Orks, it had excited them. Every greenskin with any ambition wanted to be the one who crumped the fancy metal thing, and they kept throwing themselves at the Dreadnoughts with increasing enthusiasm. By the time they reached the approach to the Warboss's territory, the Dreadnoughts had collectively killed over 300 Orks, and their ammunition supplies were running critically low. Meridius was down to 40% on his heavy bolter. Thaddeus had exhausted his flamer fuel entirely, and Davius was conserving his remaining ammunition for the main fight. Only their close combat weapons remained at full effectiveness, the power fields and mechanical systems requiring no ammunition, just power from their reactors.
Skull Guzzler's camp was located in what had once been the main cargo bay of an Imperial transport ship before it was absorbed into the space hulk. The massive chamber was easily large enough to hold several thousand orcs, and currently it held about 500 of the biggest, meanest greenskins on the hulk. These weren't random boys looking for a fight. These were the war boss's personal mob, veterans of countless raids and battles, equipped with the best looted weapons and armor that Ork technology could provide. And at the center of it all sat war boss Skull Guzzler himself. The massive Ork stood nearly 10 feet tall, his body a combination of muscle, cybernetics, and armor plates welded directly onto his skin. One of his arms had been replaced entirely with a power claw, a mechanical claw large enough to crush a space marine in full armor. His other hand held a custom shooter that looked like it had been assembled from parts of at least 3 different weapons and held together primarily through Ork belief and wishful thinking. His head was topped with a huge metal jaw implant that gave him a permanent grimace and made his voice echo with mechanical fury. The war boss was in the middle of settling a dispute between 2 of his nobs when Scrapzog led the Dreadnoughts into the cargo bay. The sudden silence that fell across the chamber was almost physical as 500 Orks turned to stare at the 4 towering war machines that had just invaded their territory. For a moment, nobody moved. The Orks were processing what they were seeing, and the Dreadnoughts were assessing the tactical situation. Then Skull Guzzler started laughing. It was a deep, booming sound that echoed off the cargo bay walls, a laugh that combined genuine amusement with anticipation of violence.
So, this is what's been causing all the ruckus. 4 metal gits think they can just walk into my camp and start trouble. I like it. Shows spirit. Stupid, but spirit.
He rose from his makeshift throne, which appeared to be constructed from welded-together tank treads, an Imperial Gothic architecture looted from somewhere. Oi, metal things! You got names? I like to know what I'm crumpin'. Meridius stepped forward, his full height and ancient majesty on display. I am Brother Ancient Meridius of the Crimson Castellans, veteran of 45 centuries of warfare, hero of Talasar Prime, and the wrath of the Emperor made manifest. I do not need to know your name, Xenos, because you will not live long enough for it to matter. The cargo bay erupted in roars and shouts, Orks working themselves into a frenzy at the challenge. Skull Guzzler's grin widened, showing teeth that had been replaced with metal fangs.
I like you, Metal Git. You got proper attitude, but you's in my camp now, which means you's gonna get crumped. Boys, let's show these tin cans how Orks fight.
What followed was not a battle. It was a war in miniature, a clash of 2 fundamentally different approaches to violence. The Orks came at the Dreadnoughts in waves, dozens at a time, their weapons blazing and their choppers raised. The Dreadnoughts met them with disciplined fire and devastating close combat, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. And in the middle of it all, Scrapzog huddled behind whatever cover he could find, occasionally shouting advice that was completely ignored by both sides. Meridius was in his element. This was what he had been built for, what he had trained for across 3 centuries as a flesh and blood marine and 45 more centuries as a dreadnought. He was a weapon of the Emperor, pointed at enemies of mankind and unleashed to do what weapons do. His heavy bolter carved lanes through the Ork mob. His power fist crushed anything that got close. And his tactical mind, honed by millennia of warfare, coordinated his brother's actions into a unified killing machine that the Orks could neither overwhelm nor outmaneuver. But the Orks were not without their own advantages. Their numbers were vast, their enthusiasm unlimited, and their whack energy was strengthening them with every moment of combat. More importantly, they had deaf dreads, 2 of them, which now lumbered into battle with their Ork pilots roaring challenges through their Vox speakers. The deaf dreads were crude compared to Imperial dreadnoughts, cobbled together from scrap metal and whatever the mech boys could scavenge, but they were still dangerous. Each one stood nearly as tall as Meridius, bristling with guns and close combat weapons. Their pilots, Orks who had volunteered to be hardwired into the machines, were half mad from the process, but twice as eager to fight.
Enemy walkers, Meridius announced. Davius, Castus, engage the deaf dreads. Thaddeus, you are with me. We push for the war boss. The battle split into multiple fronts. Davius and Castus moved to intercept the deaf dreads, their superior Imperial technology giving them an edge, but their depleted ammunition making the fight more difficult than it should have been. Meridius and Thaddeus drove forward towards Skull Guzzler, cutting through Orks like a ship through water, leaving carnage in their wake. Skull Guzzler met them head-on, his power claw crackling with energy and his custom shooter roaring as he fired. The warboss was laughing, a sound of pure joy that seemed incongruous given the violence surrounding it. Now this is a proper fight. Come on den, Metal Gits. Let's see if you's as tough as you think you are. The clash between Meridius and Skull Guzzler was brutal. The power claw met the power fist in a shower of sparks, both weapons' energy fields struggling against each other. Skull Guzzler was strong, far stronger than any unaugmented being had a right to be, and his cybernetic enhancements gave him strength that approached Dreadnought levels. But Meridius had 4,500 years of combat experience, and experience counted for more than raw power. You fight well for a Xenos, Meridius admitted, blocking another blow from the power claw. But you cannot win. Your strength is great, but mine is greater. Your armor is thick, but mine is thicker. And your life is measured in decades while I have fought for millennia. Skull Guzzler laughed even as he bled from a dozen wounds. That's where you's wrong, Metal Git. I don't need to win. I just need to enjoy the fight. And this is the best fight I've had in years. Nearby, Thaddeus was dealing with the Knobs, who tried to support their warboss, his close combat weapons making short work of even the biggest Orks. Further back, Davius had destroyed one of the deaf dreads by literally tearing it apart with his power fist, and Castus was working on the second with methodical efficiency. The tide of battle was turning in favor of the Dreadnoughts, but the cost was high. All four were showing significant damage now, their armor scarred and scored by countless hits. The end came suddenly. Meridius feinted left, then struck right, his power fist catching Skull Guzzler's power claw and ripping it completely off the warboss's body. The massive orc stumbled backward, green blood pouring from the wound, his expression shifting from joy to surprise. And then Meridius hit him again, this time in the center of mass, the power fist punching completely through the warboss's armor and body. Skull Guzzler looked down at the fist protruding from his chest, then back up at Meridius. Heh, that was a good one, Metal Git. You's earned it. And then the light faded from his eyes, and warboss Skull Guzzler, terror of 3 systems and leader of thousands of Orks, died with what looked almost like a smile on his face. The death of the warboss broke the Ork mob's spirit. One moment they were fighting with enthusiasm, the next they were running for the exits, trampling each other in their haste to escape the metal monsters that had killed their leader. Some tried to put up token resistance, but most simply fled, driven by a rare moment of self-preservation. Let them run, Meridius commanded, overriding Thaddeus's impulse to pursue. We need them to spread the word of what happened here. Every Ork on this hulk needs to know that we are not to be trifled with. They stood there in the cargo bay, 4 dreadnoughts surrounded by hundreds of Ork corpses, their armor scored and damaged, but their weapons still functional. They had won. Against overwhelming odds, they had broken the warboss's mob and cleared a path to the landing bays. All that remained was to find a ship that worked and escape this nightmare. Scrapzog emerged from cover, his expression a mixture of terror, awe, and unmistakable excitement. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. You lot are proper killy. You know that? I mean really, really killy. I ain't never seen anything like it. The landing bays, Meridius reminded him. How far? Just down the next corridor, Scrapzog said, pointing toward an exit. But there's a problem. All the ships that work are gonna have pilots, and them pilots are gonna be real upset about what just happened. We might have to crump a few more Orks before you can get away. Meridius looked at his brothers, assessing their status. They were all damaged, all low on ammunition, but they were functional. They could complete the mission. They would complete the mission. Because that was what the Adeptus Astartes did. They completed missions, no matter the cost. "Then we finish this," he declared. "One final push, brothers, for the Emperor and the Crimson Castellans." And with that, the 4 dreadnoughts and their unexpected guide began their final approach to freedom, leaving behind them a legend that would be told around Ork campfires for generations. The story of the ancient metal warriors who woke up, killed a war boss, and left the surviving Orks too scared to follow them. It was, in its own way, the perfect Ork story. Violent, dramatic, and absolutely unforgettable. The long nightmare of Brother Ancient Meridius was approaching its end, but the memories of what had happened on this day would last forever, both in his databanks and in the stories that Orks would tell about the time we woke up the ancient metal boss who crumped everyone. Some legends, it seemed, were earned the hard way, and this one had been very, very hard indeed.